welcome to the Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy, the free podcast for motivated teachers and school leaders who want to inspire their students and school community in literacy learning. Make sure you subscribe to the show on your favourite podcast player, and for more amazing literacy resources, check out the show notes provided with every episode.
Hi, I'm Sharon and I'm the host of A Teacher's Toolkit for Literacy. In every Toolkit episode, we bring you specific resources, tools, strategies, tips, techniques to help you in your job as a teacher of literacy. Firstly, we acknowledge and pay our respects to the Kaurna people, the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on. We acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. And welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Sharon. Great to be here. Welcome to part 2 of our podcast, helping you navigate the science of reading and what it's all about. Let's continue our conversation with experts Diane Snowball and Keay Cobbin. So that takes me to my next question, is having reading materials in a classroom that are inviting and exciting right from the age of 5 is an important aspect, isn't it, Di?
Oh, it sure is. I mean, for a start, you said inviting. You know, I read what can be called a decodable book, and all books should be decodable, but the type of book where they're only using perhaps in type words and everything only revolves around using very specific word patterns. Then I read one of those books out to my husband the other night and he said, "What in the world is that all about?" And even when I gave him the book to read, he looked right through it. He said, "I haven't got a clue what that's about." So look for what makes sense and is going to be interesting to read. He said that would drive me off ever wanting to read if I had that sort of diet. So just be smart, making, those sorts of decisions. You might be being forced to do particular things in a school. Unfortunately, perhaps you're not getting enough say about it. So you look for the very best of what there is in that. And, when it comes to decodable books, there is actually no specific evidence that says a child cannot learn to read unless they have some decodable books. That does not exist. But if you want kids to practice, let's say you've been doing some onset rhyme work and you've been doing something about op words, then you have the children not just make a list of words that might be, if you can spell hop, you can spell stop, mop, crop, etc. But also, can they write some sentences with those sorts of words in them? And they can have fun with them, like perhaps Dr. Seuss does with some of his books, Hop on Pop or whatever, and then read each other's. So they're going to get double whammy of understanding use of op as a writer, use of op as a reader, and even from that go on to, well, if I can spell shop, how would I write shopping? And
morphology
and shops, so that kids will sometimes come up with those words themselves. We don't want to stop that by limiting them with a book. You're only allowed to have this book with these words in it, but let's make our own with those patterns, and then the kids can write them, construct them, and then read them. So it's the encoding and the decoding happening, which is much more powerful for them than just being given a book with those spelling patterns in them or rhymes, R-I-M-E-S, to read, because that's what they always are. It's a short vowel followed by a consonant. That's how the short vowels get to be constant. So you can easily fit it in with your onset rhyme work as part of your phonological awareness.
But as you were talking, Di, I was writing down, you were talking about independent writing, shared reading, interactive writing, all of those that many of our teachers, particularly if you're teaching students in foundation grade 1 and grade 2, they know those pedagogical practices.
Exactly.
Having the agency to actually employ those different pedagogies appropriately and to reinforce the learning, I think is critical. And also, it's so much more engaging for students and for teachers themselves.
Yes.
So if we don't know those pedagogical practices, we need to build our knowledge around them. That's where we talk about content knowledge and pedagogical knowledge. But what an engaging way for kids to actually, learn the code.
Exactly. And, you can be systematic about the learning if you like.
Yes.
If you think, okay, I want to make sure nothing's left out. So I'll have a list of whether it's rhymes, R-E-M-E-S, or whether it's sounds or spelling patterns. You can have a list and make sure that you're covering everything. It doesn't mean that you have to do everything the same way and that you're not allowed to bring it up during shared reading or shared writing, because, again, you have to do that to show the kids how to make use of this knowledge, not just to say, I know that when I see the letters C, it could be pronounced this way, or this way. But, yeah, but how will that help you as a reader when you see the letter C? What could we find out that will make sure it will transfer to your reading? Or if we hear a particular sound, how are you going to represent that as a writer? Let's make sure we find out. But I can be very systematic about how I go about that.
Even from the age of 5, we need to show children excellent models of the English language, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. Look, you only have to look at the books parents read to children before they go to school, if those kids then become readers by the time they get into school. And I bet all of us could make a list of what those sorts of books are. And there are more things like The Very Hungry Caterpillar, come on, Kay, Who Sank the Boat?
Yes.
Several books by Eric Carle, by Mem Fox, by Pat Hutchins, by Pamela Allen. And some of them go right back to many, many years ago.
Yes.
Goodnight Moon. I mean, that book must be about 70 years old. I can't even...
I can see the picture. I can actually see the image on the front page.
You can. And wonderful books like Rosie's Walk. And do you know the interesting thing is, you have to also do an incredible amount of inferring. When you read Rosie's Walk, if you're not looking at the pictures to see that the rake has come up and hit the fox on the head, there's even some lines on the page that indicate the rake has moved in that way. You're inferring everything that happens in the main part of the story of that book. So what a wonderful opportunity with that sort of material to be starting to teach inferring, predicting, visualising, etc., but particularly inferring. I find in so many of those books we are working out from something we know to something the author says that we can infer from that and infer from the pictures. Right, we have to be very careful not to say, don't use the pictures. Okay, don't use the pictures to find out how to say the word, but for heaven's sake, you might have to use the pictures to find out the understanding, the comprehension of what it's about, especially in non-fiction. You know, in non-fiction it might say, rabbits eat lots of vegetables. And then they'll have a drawing of carrots and lettuce and celery with labels. Well, what are you going to infer from that? The vegetables that rabbits eat must be carrots, celery and lettuce. And we need to show children how to make those relationships in the reading of non-fiction. Imagine if they never got to read non-fiction or have non-fiction read to them. When are they going to learn how to do that? And it can start from that very beginning of school.
Which actually I was thinking about when you said, Phil, about the importance of having rich literature in classrooms. Mm-hmm. And, you know, you talked about those students that come to school that can already read or have had that beautiful literature that you just reeled off there off the top of your tongue in their homes. But we know there are many students that don't have that.
Oh, my goodness, that's
so
for sure.
How critical it is for every classroom. It's an equity issue for me.
I agree,
for
Charlie.
Students to get access to the rich literature from the time they come to school.
Absolutely.
And absolutely essential. If there are kids who've missed out on that sort of literature before they start school, then it's imperative that they have that literature when they get to school. Otherwise, they're going to stay disadvantaged forever.
Yes.
You just can't make up for that sort of literature not being read to them. And so I give lists to schools for their prep in grade 1, grade 2 in particular, and even beyond that, of course, what's the rich literature for all ages to get? But in particular, those kids who we want them to love reading, be engaged with reading, hear rich literature. And the interesting thing is, of course, they ask for those books to be read 100 times.
Over and over and over. Like a
over.
small child will ask.
Exactly. And what does that do for them? They start to notice words and what they look like and what they say. I mean, how do we start to see those high-frequency words coming through in their writing even before someone showed it to them? They've seen those words over and over again in those books, in any really good piece of literature. So, yes, to me, it's absolutely essential that all kids get access to those.
You're seeing it and hearing it.
Absolutely, yep. And, that's where shared reading came from. Don Holdaway observing what was happening in homes where kids were being read to, and they were being read the same stuff over and over again. In fact, the first big books were called the Read It Again series.
Were they? I didn't know that.
And kids would get to the end of the book being read to them and they would say, read it again. And so that was why they were called the Read It Again series. And they had to be good enough for the kids to want being read to them many times. If they weren't, then they were not really suitable for shared reading.
And you don't even have to buy big books. You can make them.
Oh, well, that's what they did at first. There were no published ones. Don Holdaway, I can remember when he came to Melbourne in 1974, and he actually demonstrated for us at Footscray North Primary School how to do shared reading. And he only had his own made books, that he used traditional tales to actually make the books, because they would have that element of the storyline that you can join in with once you've heard it a few times and you want to read it again and again and again. And that's what he was looking for. Unfortunately, too many publishers thought to be for shared reading, all it had to be was a big book.
Right.
And boy, they brought out some garbage because of that.
Yep.
But the teachers know which are the good ones, and they cry out for them.
Well, you can actually see which are the good ones because I'm visualising prep classrooms where in independent reading time students will go and they'll pick the books off the shelf and they'll sit down with a partner and they'll do, that reading it again. Did you say reading it over or reading it again?
Yeah.
That's what they do.
They do. They just build up this confidence in themselves as readers too. So I think we have to look at all kinds of literature and say, what would be the benefit of including that? Instead of just saying you're never allowed to have that and you're always only allowed to have this. There's quite a variety that will give you a lot of benefit about learning about being a reader and a writer, of course.
And the research backs up having rich literature from a young age.
And do you know, in relation to that, one of the areas that Kay, you mentioned that is in the active view of reading that's mentioned is motivation, and all related to engagement. If you really like the material, like the text, you want to read it and you want to read other texts as well. And also having them in your classroom that you mentioned, one of the things that they learned about motivation, that kids, if they've got easy access to books they can read, then they will read more.
Yes.
If they've got to go somewhere else to get it and it's not in the classroom, then they don't have that easy access, and so it doesn't happen as easily.
That's backed up by Richard Allington's work as well.
Oh, definitely. And, in these journal articles that Kay has told you about, Richard is still writing. One of the articles in the 2021 journal, I think it is, that the information that we know about the volume of reading being really important is still there. So he's still been researching it and still found that the volume of actual real reading of real texts is absolutely one of the most important things about helping children's reading develop. It's like you've been saying, Kay, it's not necessarily something new. It might be continuing the same research and getting more and more support for what was originally known.
But I also think that not only are we encouraging motivation or fostering motivation and engagement, every time we pick up a well-written book, we're teaching children something about the world.
Yes, it's true.
And, if you reflect back to the books that you mentioned there, every one of them, students can come away going, I learned a little bit more about the world, or I actually built a little bit of empathy. I'm feeling sorry for that character. All of these are really life skills that students need, knowledge, but also being able to relate to characters and to feel empathy for characters. And I was going to say root for characters like I was at the baseball in America, but, like champion for a character. I think this is what we want our little children doing, this sort of work, being so deeply engaged with books so that when they're in high school, they really want to read.
And we know the ones that work, like Charlotte's Web, or the kids just adore these books. They work.
After all this time, some of those favourites are still the favourites. It's because they were so well written.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, going on to our next question, can I also ask you to talk about teaching comprehension, because you alluded to something earlier about comprehension instruction with our youngest readers. Would you share your thoughts on this?
Yeah, in fact, Kay was really talking about some of the aspects of that right then when you
Yes.
were talking about empathy. You know, being able to put yourselves in the role of the character and feel what they're feeling really shows how much you're comprehending the text.
Yes.
And, you know, they are quite capable of doing that sort of thing even before they start school. But yes, we can still say, and we know from the research, that there are a number of specific comprehension strategies that we should teach children. And, you know, those same strategies are taught year in, year out, right through the first years at school and through to secondary and even beyond. What changes is the complexity of the text, but the same strategies are there to be taught and applied by the kids. And to say that you shouldn't be doing that from the beginning of school, again, you know, that's an issue of equity as well, Kay, isn't it?
Absolutely.
That some kids not getting that and other kids getting it. We actually have someone in part of Melbourne who has the audacity to be telling teachers and principals definitely not to teach comprehension before grade 3. That just makes me so angry. How dare someone do that? And I haven't yet found any research to back that up in comparison with the amount of research that says you should teach comprehension from very early on in school, the very early ages of children learning to read. We could give you some quotes about that.
Can I just add on there?
Yeah.
I think that the other thing around, I agree absolutely about that. And if we looked at our standards, the Australian curriculum, it's pretty clear about teaching comprehension from the moment students come to school. But I know I'm going on a little bit about equity, but, you know, when we teach comprehension well, and many student teachers are doing this really, really well, we use beautifully constructed literature and well-written non-fiction and a variety of texts. But also, to teach kids comprehension well, we engage them in rich, deep dialogue.
Of course.
They're learning to talk and communicate to each other, whatever year level it is. And we know that's important, but it's really critical for those students who, one, may not be exposed to good literature, but also may not come from a home where we sit around the table or we sit with our children and read and get them to talk about it. And I think that that is very sad to think that we'd even deny any student of foundation year 1, year 2, the opportunity to engage in that sort of work as a reader. It's like saying they can't do it. Let's stop having a deficit mindset. Kids can do it. So
they're comprehending before they come to school, you know, before they actually decode, they're comprehending.
In fact, one of my major research studies was observing children who were read to before they start to school and just to see what the interaction was, because I know it's not a matter of just read to the kids and that'll be it. And what I found was that the children would interrupt their parents or carers to ask questions about what was being read to them. They would even physically take the book and turn back pages and ask questions about something in the text. And I followed those kids through into school. And because teachers in those days used to be, you know, I'll read this and then I'll ask these comprehension questions, the kids soon learned, I don't ask questions while I'm reading because the teacher's going to do that. Well, so many teachers now know that if they just let the children have that right sort of mindset to be wondering while they're reading, that they'll come out with questions of their own. And it's that self-questioning that's such an important comprehension strategy to have in order to really understand what's going on and stay monitoring your understanding, which, of course, is one of those important self-regulation.
But if we're talking today, we're talking about the science of reading and we're talking about research. As you said, Di, I can't think of any body of research that substantiates not to teach comprehension. I can't.
No.
So I think that we keep going back to and saying, well, okay, why is reading comprehension the end product of the models that we talked about?
Yeah.
It's enough for us to say, you know what, this needs to be taught. So I hope that we stand firm on this one because I think, as I said, it's absolutely vital part of a reading program for every student.
And it's equity for children.
Yeah. Definitely. And by the way, someone might say, oh, here's a piece of research done by somebody that says don't teach comprehension till grade 3. Well, then I want to say, well, I'm going to show you 5,000 pieces of research that say you should. So it's not just one person's statement about it. Remember, all of this to do with science of reading is multiple pieces of research by multiple people from very different walks of life in education, etc. So just showing me one or two, it might be done by someone with a bias about that for some reason. So I need to have multiple evidence, and there's plenty there about why comprehension teaching should start in the very first year at school.
I keep going back to a little knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, I'd like to pick up on the motivation and engagement and this area of executive skills. Can you talk to these for me?
Okay, why don't you do that? Because I think you've really got a great understanding of what those are about.
Well, we've sort of talked a lot about comprehension in the context of, and as you were talking about comprehension, Di, I was just thinking about how with rich comprehension instruction and the opportunity for students to have the opportunity to practice that on books of their own choice,
Yes.
how motivating and engaging, how that adds and contributes to motivation and engagement. So choice and control, so much research established around how important that is for students around motivation and engagement. And just this morning when I was listening to Peter Afflerbach and people were asking about what do we do about motivation and engagement, he pointed to the strong research base for motivation and engagement in reading comprehension. But he also made another really interesting point, which I thought, I'm going to actually explore that a little bit myself. He said he sees a lot of comprehension instruction in schools, but he said often what's forgotten or ignored is the student's self-efficacy.
Yes.
Is immaterial. And he was very positive in the context for teachers. They were doing a great job in comprehension instruction, but he was talking about if the student doesn't feel good about themselves as reader and doesn't believe that they can get better, their motivation and engagement will decline and they won't want to read. So I think that this area of motivation and engagement, if I go back to the active view of reading, it is a contributor. For some students, particularly challenged students, it's going to be something that we need to be thinking about. How do we motivate and engage students? For some students, particularly some unmotivated and engaged kids in secondary, it's actually to get them to pick up a book. And I've been reading a lot around Chris Tavani's work, and I just think she's a wonderful educator. And I was watching a podcast of hers that she did with Pembroke Publishing, and I just thought she had so many really important points about what does she do regarding motivating and engaging kids, because she deals with some challenging kids, and how important it is for curriculum and putting the right books in the right kids' hands. And that's what Afflerbach was talking about this morning. We have to give kids the opportunity to read the things that they want to read, even if it's what we don't want them, we might want them reading. But I think that it's an area that we really need to be mindful of and to assess.
Yeah, sure. And, them reading what they want to read can at least be the starting point that gets them into the habit of reading and enjoying reading. And then, it's not like I just sit back and watch as a teacher. I then have the responsibility to keep that going, to help them to find books, A, that they're interested in, and B, that they will be able to read with understanding. Yes. Because as soon as they don't understand, then they start to lose the enjoyment.
Yes.
And so it's a really crucial thing. And I know a lot of teachers really appreciate the nuances of that and are asking for advice about the sorts of things that particular kids might want to read. Quite often it's boys, or even how it might happen, trying to get their male in their lives to show interest in reading sometimes can be the important thing to read to them or whatever, or whoever influences them. But there's a lot of things to do to make sure that we really keep that enjoyment, motivation going. So they're still practicing all of these things we're trying to teach them.
Right from the start of school, we want them to say, I am a writer and I am a reader.
Oh, absolutely. And, I want to say that as much as I understand that some books the kids are really just memorising, and not even taking notice of the words. And I'm particularly thinking about very beginning readers who get a book that might be, I like pigs, I like dogs, and so, there's this pattern, and they pick that up and they're not even looking at the words and they say, I'm reading. Well, that could very well be the starting point. I am a reader. And if it's that book that makes them feel that way, off we go. Because then I know how to go about specifically teaching them how to be able to identify the words and figure out how to pronounce words, say words, and then all of the other things that go with that, what do they mean and so forth.
Not guessing.
But definitely not guessing. I would never use the word as a teacher. And, some teachers do, but it's not their fault. They just haven't had the opportunity to get enough professional learning to realise that it's much better to say you can predict what the word is with the evidence that you've got. So it's not just have a look and guess by reading on or guess by reading back, but what will you find out by reading on or by reading back, but also making sure that they know they've got to look at the letters of the word, and it might be any part of it that they recognise that will help them to say the word. But I'm not going to say guess. It's a good thing for everybody to remember not to use the word guess. And I'd like to make a point, though, just there, Kay, I'm sorry, but it just reminded me of, it was last week where I was in a foundation class. It's the first year at school, and the kids were during independent reading time, and I was at the table with 4 or 5 kids all reading in some way or doing quite different things. Some kids were still working out how to make a match with what they said and what was on the page and using their finger to help them do that. Understanding what a word is, even comes before some of the other stuff, doesn't it, that concepts of print. But one little girl who was quite a good reader was reading The Cat Tried to Catch the Mouse, okay? So she read the cat and then she got to the word tried and was spot on, looking at the word, going, she could see there was d at the end, but she could not work out what that word was, how to say it. And so I said to her, well, let's stop and figure out what's going on and see if that will help you work out that word. So let's read on and see if that will help us. The cat to catch the mouse. Tried, she said, because she had that semantics and syntax taking place to help with what she knew about the letters in the word. And so I'm very careful when I'm working with teachers for them not to say, don't do this and don't do that. But it's sort of like, in this case, will this help? In this case, will this help? Because there's the next boy on the same table trying to read. The cat called out, and he was saying, came to called, cal, okay, sure, using sound symbol knowledge, but it wasn't working. This doesn't, the cat, cal?
It's not enough.
What's going on? It doesn't ring any bells to me, doesn't make sense. And I said to him, well, I can understand why you're saying for the letter A, because it often is that, but it isn't always. And if we just look at the ALL part of this word, what do you see? And he said all. Okay, now let's put the k sound at the beginning, the letter C is in this case a k. What will it be? Call. Call, the cat called. So there again, it's not just one strategy by itself that's helping him to work out how to say the word. And in that case, he actually had to reread and think about what else could that word be. They had already done some work actually with the rhyme, R-A-M-E, all. There was that chart in the room, but he wasn't making use of it. So we've even got to say to kids, you see, we're developing these charts because you could use this information when you're reading and you're writing. And again, that's the explicit part, the usage of what we're teaching them. But it's not, I'm not allowed to use the picture, because I can assure you he looked at the picture of this, picture of a cat, mouth open wide, and what was coming out was, ah! And that helped him rereading, seeing that picture, what this word was. It's all got to go together.
But I also think that as you're talking to, I was thinking about the English language itself. And if our teachers have got a good understanding of the English language, and while it's morphemically consistent,
Yes.
Phonologically, it's not.
Exactly.
So I think 56% of words can be actually worked out through, matching. It's an opaque language, the English language. It's not a transparent language. So if we were learning Finnish or Italian, and somebody was telling me the other day that Indonesian's very transparent language, but we've got an opaque language. When our teachers understand that, we need to give kids a repertoire of ways to get to words.
Definitely.
And we're doing them a disservice if we're not teaching them that. But I just wanted to quickly go back when I'm talking about motivation and engagement. Just for your listeners, Phil, I think Chris Tavani's work is really powerful work, and she does a lot of work around motivation and engagement. She talks a lot about kids wearing masks, and when they struggle with reading, they have all these different masks that they wear. And I was talking to a secondary teacher and she said, that happens in secondary school, but it doesn't happen in primary. I said, yes, it does. Yes, it does. Children put on masks very, very early in their primary years.
What do you mean?
They put
on a mask.
So they put on a mask like they look tough, or they'll be disinterested, or I hate reading. So this is a mask that they wear to cover up the fact that they're struggling.
Okay.
And,
right, I understand what you mean.
Sort of thinking about a lot of these students around motivation, engagement and executive functioning, some of the components of the active view of reading would be really thoughtful and helpful for working with students like that. So I just wanted to reference Chris Tavani's work because it's very, very powerful for teachers with students that are upper primary and into secondary.
Now, just wrapping up with our final question, Kay, you talked about Kelly Cartwright's book, Executive Function and Reading Comprehension. What are these skills and why is it important for our teachers to know about them?
Yes, right at the moment I'm ploughing through Kelly Cartwright's 2023 second edition book, which is called Executive Skills and Reading Comprehension. And it's one of those cases, Phil and Di, where you're really employing your comprehension strategy.
Yeah.
How do you say it? It's a challenge read, but it's also, I think it could be a really fantastic book to do as a book club with a group of teachers if they wanted to build their knowledge in this particular area. But I just wanted to read a quote from this book where she explains a little bit more about executive skills. She doesn't call them executive functioning skills, she calls them executive skills. Our executive skills enable us to be effective managers of our brains and thinking processes. As educators, in addition to teaching reading, writing and arithmetic, we must equip our students to become CEOs of their own brains so that they can become active, independent, self-regulated readers who know how to manage their thinking to decode and understand texts. And I love that, like kids becoming CEOs of their brains,
Yes,
self-regulation.
Yeah.
She talks about her purpose for the writing the book was really to explain executive skills and show teachers how to incorporate these into their classroom instruction, particularly if the intention is to provide executive skills-based intervention strategies that students can employ to improve both their executive function and their reading comprehension. I like how Cartwright talks about this being relatively new thinking. So once again, going back to what Di said right at the beginning of the podcast about new knowledge continually contributing to our understanding. And results are sort of starting to emerge that there's a potential to improve our comprehension instruction and make a real difference for students who are challenged in this area. And I get excited by that too, because I think there is room for all of us to improve the way we're teaching comprehension. She delves deeply into the subcomponents that are in the active view of readings in the book, and these are cognitive flexibility, working memory, inhibition, organisation and planning. So I'm not going to go into any great depth in either of those. If people are interested, I would just really recommend reading the book. And what I really like about this is that she links each of these executive skills to comprehension strategies that we're all really familiar with. And I think helping teachers to see and teach these is highly valuable. She gives an example of a student that's strong decoding, language comprehension, but when she asks her to read, the student can't talk about what they've just read, and she explains how she did a lot of work with the student around planning for reading and organising their reading and planning with a real goal in mind. And I have to say, when I think about, I think teachers do a really good job of helping kids to set goals, but we need to be asking our students, what's your purpose? And particularly our challenged readers. I'm thinking of somebody close, child in my family that's, year 5, very close, really strong reader with rich family life with all the language comprehension and word recognition skills. But what he needs to move him forward as a reader as he goes further into end of primary, into secondary, reading much more complex texts, he needs those executive functioning skills. He needs to be able to avoid distractions. He needs to be able to plan his work and have a really clear goal around why he's reading and execute a plan, and not on his own. He needs to be supported to do that. Yeah. And I think that might help him to become a closer reader, a more engaged reader. So this is relatively new. As I say, 2023, they can't get a book that's any newer than that, can you really? But it is building on some things that we've known too.
Yes.
What I think is fascinating is the first time I've thought about those comprehension skills being linked. See, I've always thought metacognition was so important, understanding, being able to articulate what you are doing as a reader, for example, and knowing what you're good at, what you need to work at. And I think that's come through where teachers take the time and know how important it is to sit down with children during independent reading time and actually find out what kids are doing. Let them know what they're really good at. Often they're very surprised when you say, do you understand that you're really good at figuring out what
Yes.
words mean or which ones you need to find out or whatever it is. But I can see that your goal needs to be, and that's a very important part of a conference, to help articulate what their goals are. But what I'm now thinking is I actually also need them to be thinking about, can they work out what their goals are?
Yes.
Because that's even them being more in control. So I'm sort of pushing myself now because of the way she describes these skills that I might have known about. Like self-monitoring was a really important comprehension skill, okay, and strategy. And now I'm thinking, well, I want them to be aware of that's their goal and to have figured that out for themselves rather than me telling them that's your goal. So I'm dying to have my next lot of conferences with kids and seeing what happens with that. But when Pearson and Duke actually have a book called What Does Instruction Teach Us About How to Teach Reading or Reading Instruction, okay? And they would every few years have a new edition of it, and they would focus on comprehension, fluency, vocabulary, and much more than the main 5. And they'd be looking at what else do we now know about these. And they listed comprehension strategies like self-monitoring. Well, no, self-monitoring wasn't in their early group.
Right.
And then by 2011, it was. So I've sort of known that since then, but now I'm even thinking more about it because of Kelly Cartwright's work. But I think we need to say, okay, I knew something about that. Now I know more. How can I put that into practice? And I do know the more that you can put the onus onto kids, the better they become at it all. So if independent reading and conferences weren't taking place, there would be no opportunity for a teacher to even teach kids how to do that.
No. And to sit down with a student and talk to them about, like when you say have a goal, but you then have to have a plan.
Exactly.
And
you can have the goal, but how am I going to achieve it? And I think that's part of what I've learned I need to add to conferences, not just to say this is your goal, but let's think about how you'll be able to achieve that. And what will you need to do? And when can I come back and check in on you that you think you'll have had a go at this and we can talk about it more? And that's showing them that we need to plan. But I now need to also say, so that's a plan I have for you this time. Next time we talk about this, I want you to be thinking about the plan of how you'll achieve it.
But I also think, adding on to that, I think you could say to the student, you know what, this is just a life skill. This is what we need to plan and organise ourselves if we want to achieve our goals. So we do that in reading, but we do that in all walks of life. Just going back to, I really love, there's a couple of pages in there where she just unpacks each
comprehension strategy, and then she makes that link to how that relates to an executive skill. And I just think this is relatively new work for myself, like you said, Di, and I think it can take the work that I do with teachers to a new level in comprehension instruction.
Yeah, it's an exciting area, isn't it? Executive function.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It won't be new for a lot of people who are used to working with neurodiverse students.
Right.
Executive function it's not new in the context of, it's not a new, idea. A tremendous lot has been written about executive function for neurodiverse students, but this is relatively new when it's related to comprehension.
Okay.
And that's what she makes that very clear.
Great. I think we better wrap up today, but thank you both for your contribution. It's been fantastic. Is there a final comment you'd like to make to teachers out there, or teachers and leaders?
I'll remain open-minded. Continue your own professional learning. We'll give you a list of articles, podcasts, webcasts, etc., and make your own plan, okay, about what you think you need to set as a goal and how you will go about achieving that. And I think that if you could look to listening to podcasts, you'll find that easy to fit into your life, than try and read everything.
I think there's been a real clarity today, opening up, clearly what things are and what they mean, because sometimes we just don't know where to go to find out what's what.
Can I just add on there then, for one of the last things that I'd like to say is that you said open-minded, Di, but I think my plea is to make sure that we all read from a wide range of experts and really listen, because each one in their own way is going to contribute to our content and pedagogical knowledge and help us all grow as professionals. And you did say, Di, it's overwhelming, but it is overwhelming for teachers and even us sometimes when I think about, oh my goodness me, there's so much more I want to learn, but aren't we lucky as a profession to have a wealth of research that can help us guide our own practice?
Absolutely. And, I think that it's very hard when you're a beginning teacher because, what you can learn before you actually have your own classroom is quite limiting as much as you might want to. So just remember that if you are just starting out, it's okay that there's a long way to go. You can't learn everything at once, but just don't stop. The more you learn, the more you'll enjoy your teaching anyway. And, there's nothing worse than someone who's only been teaching for a couple of years thinking that they know everything. They're almost too smart for their own good in a way. And I remember when I first started teaching in a primary school and I had a prep class as my first, I thought, first of all, I'll have to resign. I don't know enough about this. But what I did instead was I tried to find things to read and learn. And, there wasn't nearly as much around then. I'm talking about, 56 years ago. There wasn't as much. And what was available in the rest of the world, we didn't have access to, some sort of search engine to find it. Whereas now I can just say, I want to find out about blah, blah, and you put it in. And what you do is you make sure that you don't just read the first article or whatever, but you choose a lot of them and you think about what each person's saying and have enough confidence in yourself to say, well, now I'm going to read this and then I'm going to read that and I'm going to compare and I'm going to have a go with kids and see what really works.
Yes.
Because that often what someone's suggesting, you wonder how long have they actually been teaching in a classroom.
The more you learn, the more agency you have, the more you'll enjoy your job.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's hard being a teacher. There's a lot of teacher bashing. But by golly, you do such a wonderful service to the world by being a teacher.
Absolutely. We're here for you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep. All right, thanks, Di and Kay, and thanks everyone for listening to us today, and bye for now.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. To make sure you don't miss any literacy learning tips and insights, please subscribe to our show on your favourite podcast player. At Keay Learning, our literacy specialists draw on over 30 years of teaching and international consulting experience to deliver world-class learning solutions. We equip, empower and support teachers to become their authentic selves. To find out about upcoming webinars and about how Keay can help you and your school, visit keylearning.com.au. and you can get even more amazing teaching resources right now at teachific.com.au. Stay tuned.